This week's challenge is a particular graphic that has been posted on the internet and also has been sent to me by people who disagree with me about the Christian worldview. And here's a picture of the graphic in particular. So you can kind of get a feel for what it looks like, but let me read it to you. You have three symbols across the top of the graphic that are representative, or at least attempt to represent one of them Christianity, one of them Islam, and one of them Judaism. So it's the three monotheistic religions. And so there's two sentences, the top sentence and the bottom sentence. So the top one says this: morality is doing what is right regardless of what you are told. And then the second sentence, the bottom, says religion is doing what you are told regardless of what is right. Now, just as a side note, I want to point out that this is a good example of the way deception often works. You get these short, pithy statements that don't take long to read, they kind of roll off the tongue, that sound clever, and they sound true. But in order to figure out what's wrong with them, you have to really take some mental energy and unpack what is precisely going on and what is precisely being claimed in order to recognize the mistakes that are being made in the thinking. And so few people are going to do that, and that's why oftentimes people hear these things and they just readily believe them. This, by the way, is exactly the same problem that we see with the topic of homosexuality and of same-sex marriage. People say things like, well, you should just love everyone, or marriage equality, or shouldn't we just allow people to love whoever they choose to love? You know, all of these statements, those three statements in particular, they sound so true and reasonable, and anybody of goodwill should gather around and endorse these statements. And although there are some truths to them, there are some other things going on in the background of those statements that are mistaken, are fallacies, are mistakes in thinking. And so it takes a lot of mental energy to unpack them. And of course, in our world that we live in today with short attention span and, wanting, Pop-Tarts cooked in 3 seconds and, wanting, everything microwaved, and we just want everything quickly and delivered to us quickly, most people don't take the time and the energy to figure out what's wrong. So let's take a look at each of the two statements, the top and the bottom statement, individually and make an assessment about each one. So this first sentence says, morality is doing what is right regardless of what you are told. And I'd say with regards to that, I would say I generally agree with that sentiment. Yes, of course, we should try to follow the right course of action no matter how we are pressured to behave by our culture or by others. We should always try to do what's right. But here's the key question. How do people who identify with that top statement and allegedly don't believe in any kind of religion, how do they know what is right? Now, there's only two options. Now, the first option is that you decide what is right. Now, if that's the case, you're not necessarily doing what is right. You're simply doing what you want to do. But that's not morality. That's relativism. What's right and wrong then turns out to be relative to you. And of course, the problem with that is that everyone has their own idea of what is right and wrong. Now, the second option is that someone else decides what is right and wrong. But in that case, you're just simply doing what you are told. And that, according to the graphic, is precisely the wrong way to do it. That's the way allegedly religious people do it. Now, this brings us to our second sentence, which attempts to explain how religious people behave with regards to morality. And the second sentence is this: religion is doing what you are told regardless of what is right. Apparently religious people, and I'll just speak on behalf of Christians here since I'm a Christian, apparently religious people like Christians simply just do what they're told without any regard as to whether or not what they're doing is correct or the right course of behavior. And so we're just blindly following a set of rules that we have no idea of whether those set of rules are correct or not. But the confusion with this statement is that it presumes that religion and morality are at odds with one another. But that's precisely where Christians believe morality is coming from. They believe it comes from our Creator, God, that He is the ultimate source of morality, of moral authority. And so then when Christians do what they're told based on their religion, they are actually attempting to do what is actually right, regardless of what other people tell them to do. In other words, they are attempting to practice the virtue that is expressed in that first statement that says, morality is doing what is right regardless of what you are told. They're trying to actually fulfill that virtue. Of course, whether God exists or not makes all the difference. But answering that question, it goes beyond my point here. However, the God question does emphasize really the other problem with this second statement, and that is it smuggles in the phrase, what is right, without having any grounding whatsoever for it. In other words, how do they know that religious people aren't doing what is right unless they have some sort of standard of morality in order to make that assessment? And of course, without God existing, there's no way to ground any ultimate and objective standard of morality. So to summarize, it turns out that the reality is the opposite of what is being expressed by this graphic. It is religious people who practice the virtue that is expressed in that first statement because they attempt to do what is right regardless of what other people tell them to do. And it is people who reject religion that end up practicing the vice of doing what they are told regardless of what is right. Because they're either following their own conscience, which means that they are just following relativistic morality, which is no morality at all, and that may entail behaviors that aren't necessarily right, or they're simply doing what they are told, in which case that's a form of cultural relativism, but also they are practicing the very thing that this graphic tells us not to do, which is to do what you are simply told, regardless of what is right. So if I was to rephrase this graphic, I'd put it in these terms. I would say relativism is doing what you think is right, regardless of what is actually right. And religion is doing what is actually right, regardless of what you or culture thinks is right. In other words, the proper distinction to make is not between morality and religion, but between relativism and religion. It's a difference between people who reject that there is a God and therefore have no standard of morality, and those who believe that there is a God and have an objective and ultimate standard of morality in order to do what is right, regardless of what they are told.